podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode. I hope that you guys are doing well. I want to, before I start, I want to apologize if I sound a little stuffy because my allergies have been a little bit crazy over the past few days. But, anyways, I was like, I have this to record because this topic is important and I've been thinking about it for a long time and I want to address it and I'm finally doing it. So, let's get on with it. Today's topic is where purity culture went wrong. I'm going to start off by defining purity culture. If you grew up in church, you may be familiar with the concept, and I wanted to do a little bit of research so that I could form a proper, comprehensive definition. But I eventually wrote out something that makes sense to me, that encapsulates relatively well what purity culture is, like what's the whole idea behind it. So what I wrote is purity culture is an ideology that promotes abstinence before marriage, which is a biblical concept, through regressive and counterproductive methods. Now, purity culture has a negative connotation to it, and I think that is, with reason. However, the concept of saving yourself for marriage is good and a biblical concept, but the way that it was done or has been done through purity culture has not been good. And I'm going to go over two ideas that purity culture has preached that are harmful, that can be or potentially harmful. And the first is that purity culture's rhetoric causes negative and unhealthy ideas about sex. So, the first point underneath this title that I'd like to make is that purity culture's obsession with virginity inevitably results in negative ideas about sex. Now, I think that it's important to talk about the principles of the guidelines that were given in the Bible. Like, what's the principle behind certain things that we're told to do, or certain ways that we're told to live? Not just the words, but what's the heart behind the words there? So, for example, as I mentioned, there's like this obsession, this hyperfixation with virginity. But why are we told that? Obviously, like the Bible doesn't say specifically why, but there's practical reasons why there are certain guidelines that are given to us in the Bible. And something that could have been more effective with purity culture is giving practical reasons for why this, obviously, biblical reasons, that's number one, but like practically, why does this make sense on paper? Why does it make sense physically, biologically, emotionally, etc.? Which I'm very grateful that growing up as an adolescent in my church, we were taught that you should save yourself for marriage, but we were also taught that sex is not bad. And looking back, I recognize that wasn't always so common. That a lot of people were taught that sex is horrible, but that's not true because sex and marriage is beautiful and wonderful, and God created it. So why would God create something bad? But the context in which we have sex is that'll determine like whether or not it's a good thing in that context. So obviously, in the context of marriage, we were always taught that that is where sex belongs, doesn't belong outside of it. We were also taught a lot about soul ties, um, in like when I was younger, when I was in like youth group and all that. When I was in like middle and high school, we were taught about soul ties and like the reality of why it's important to not sleep with a bunch of people and just to sleep with your spouse. So there are practical things, practical ideas that are relevant that will make sense to people. And by just saying, don't have sex before you're married because sex is bad, that's so vague and it's not very clear. It's like, okay, what's the, like, it's not saying to, just question everything, but there's practical reasons that should be explained, opposed to just saying, don't do this because it's bad, you know? So if that were the perspective that it was coming from, that may have been more effective, but unfortunately, a lot of people did not grow up in a church or in a community where those where the principles were not discussed. So unfortunately, that causes negative ideas about sex. Now, this is not something that I've experienced, but I've heard of there being like purity balls or purity ceremonies, which I get it. I get it. However, it's just slightly odd because it feels, and like if you've done that, like I don't judge you because I feel like, I at one point I wanted to wear a purity ring and I thought that was really cool, but like because it was also trendy back when I was in middle and high school, mainly middle school, but it's also something that's like hyperfixating on virginity, and although virginity is a part of purity, is not the entire part of it, because you could be a virgin physically, but you can be having a dirty mind and you can be watching pornography every night and be lustful, lusting after everything, right? So just being a virgin is not like, that does not mean that you're pure just because you're a virgin. Is there overlap? Of course, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So those things, I mean, purity balls and ceremonies, I'm grateful I didn't have anything like that. And I know people who have done similar things, and I think that's a beautiful thing. However, it it's like it's just causes it seems like there's a weird hyperfixation on being a virgin. And it's important to save yourself and that should be honored, but I don't know. I would love to hear anyone's thoughts on this who has gone through something similar, because I haven't personally done it. I'm just looking outwardly, objectively, from like what it looks like and what people could like translate that as, especially if they're not in church, which of course, like people who are in church are going to, of course, criticize the church, so it may not be a relevant opinion, but looking outwardly, that sometimes like that might be how some people perceive that to be. So I don't know. I just figured I'd mention that because it is something that um, is definitely brought up when talking about purity culture. Another thing that I'd like to mention underneath like the rhetoric of purity culture that causes negative ideas about sex is couples feeling dirty after having sex on their wedding night. So I've heard so many stories of like not necessarily people I know personally, but like reading about like discourse online or listening to stories on like podcasts or like YouTube videos of like couples growing up underneath purity culture and feeling like, okay, we were taught that this thing was bad and now we can do it whenever we want. Like, how does this make sense? It's like there's this massive disconnect here, and it's like the ideas that sex was bad shouldn't have been taught initially because it's not true that sex is bad. God created it. It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. It makes babies. It forms connections. You form a bond. You pair bond with the person you're sleeping with. But in the context of marriage, that's where it belongs. And in this culture, that's not, most people. I mean, I don't want to say most people, maybe most people. It's very common to not say sex for marriage, and it's more normalized, it's more popularized, it's more accepted. It's honestly more accepted than saving yourself, it seems, which is interesting, just in like the culture at large. But it's like because of that, because of hookup culture, because of like sexual liberation, it's like the church went full swing, like to the other side of the pendulum, where it was like, okay, no sex, don't think about it, don't talk about it, nothing. And that makes it even worse. Like that has a very like counterproductive effect because then, and it's a regressive effect because then it causes people to like start thinking about sex more because you're not supposed to, right? It's like if you tell someone to not laugh or not smile, they do it, right? I'm not saying it's the exact same thing. However, if we don't talk about these things correctly, people are going to go somewhere else to find out more information, and it may not be the most wise or sound information that they should find or the most accurate either. So, it's important that sex is talked about from a perspective of this is something good that God created, but it was created for this context. Like, you're not supposed to wear, this is a random example, but you're not supposed to wear rain boots on the beach. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but your feet are gonna get stuck in the wet sand and you're gonna have a hard time walking. Flip flops or no shoes are ideal for the beach, right? And it's not a perfect analogy, but hopefully get the same idea across that like certain things are made for certain contexts, and sex was created by God for the context of marriage. I also wanted to mention that within purity culture, it's mainly like women in particular have been told not to like not necessarily purity culture, but when it comes to marriage, women are told not to like deprave your husband, and this is referring to First Corinthians 7 verses 4 through 6, which talks about like you shouldn't deprave your spouse, and it says women shouldn't deprave their husbands and men shouldn't deprave their wives either, so it goes both ways. But ideas like this, unfortunately, may cause individuals to believe that assault in marriage is okay because it's within a marriage. But assault is wrong in every context. It doesn't matter if you're married or not. Assault is wrong. And this passage is referring to both husbands and wives. It goes both ways, and it's not one-sided. Um, and it's just not a good idea. It's like a very toxic idea because it's like because women like generally have a lower libido than men. It's like, okay, like if your husband has to have this, he has to have his outlet. Like if he wants to have, wants to be intimate and you're sick, just let him do it. And it's like there's a lot of really negative ideas around like marital intimacy because it's like your husband has to have this and you should never deny him ever, no matter what happens. And it's like I I get that. Like I get that you should be available, and yes, you should be available. And I'm not married, so I'm not saying this from a marriage perspective. That the principle in the Bible, you should be available, but you should not be assaulted. And unfortunately, I've seen on like Twitter a lot of discourse about this, where people are defending like assault in marriages because you're married, and it does not matter. It does not matter. It is wrong. Assault is wrong. Period. Like there's no exceptions to that. And so I feel like there are some ideas that stem from purity culture that may support this, and it is just wrong and unhealthy and bad. And that's another really bad negative idea, negative rhetoric that comes from purity culture around sex in general. Purity culture also discourages many forms of physical affection, for example, holding hands and kissing and front facing hugs, things like that. And I agree that there is value in limiting excessive physical affection until marriage. However, there is definitely a healthy balance between showing affection in an appropriate manner that is comfortable for both parties, and then, and then and the other side is like practically doing it with clothes on. So it's like there's a healthy balance between the two. There's a healthy balance between, like sweet affection that's innocent, and then trying to go as far as you can without doing the act. I also wanted to mention that, like, I mentioned holding hands earlier. Um, if a person that you're seeing has a problem with holding hands, so like if holding hands causes them to be aroused or to be overwhelmed by lustful thoughts or feelings, I'd say that there's a deeper issue that needs to be addressed. That's not just about holding hands. Like there's something else going on that has to do with lust, and that's something that should be tackled. Um, So I think that there is a value in not touching too much when you're like not married. However, like I think it's also a good thing to like hold hands and hug, and like if kissing is something that's okay for both of you, then yeah, that too. So for some couples, kissing isn't a good idea. For others, it's perfectly fine. It just depends on the couple. There's nothing in the Bible that says do this or do that or don't do this or don't do that when you're dating. Because also dating didn't really exist back then, which seems pretty dope because that would be nice if dating didn't exist now either. Anyways, every couple is different, and you can't say like that all of these things should be done by every couple or all of these things should not be done. Of course, like for all couples, you should wait to have sex until you're married. However, there's nuance here. There's not like you can't say all couples can't hold hands or all couples should hold hands. Every couple is different. So it's important to look to God for wisdom and also communicate with each other about boundaries, about things that may cause you to feel some type of way, or things of that sort. So it's important to have that conversation with the person that you're seeing. But it's not a good idea to say like you can or can't do this because everyone is different. within purity culture, there are also a lot of fear-based tactics that are used to discourage premarital sex. There's a lot of like things like I don't know remember where it's from. There's like this video. It's so funny. It's a meme, and it's like I think it's like a sex ed class that's going in like the 80s or 90s or something. And it's so funny. It's hilarious. There's this kid that's like, "But teacher, what if I want to have sex before I'm married?" And she was like, "Well, I guess you'll just have to die." Literally so funny, but that's literally purity culture. It's ridiculous. That is how it feels if you're like if you were taught these kind of ideas. That's how it feels. It's like, what? If you're gonna have sex and you're just gonna die, then it's just like ridiculous. There's a lot of fear-based tactics, unfortunately, and some of it is valid. However, fear should not be used to discourage people from doing something. Like, be practical about it. Talk about the reality of the risks of sexually transmitted diseases. Talk about the reality of pair bonding and how that could affect you long term. Don't just say, don't do it because you're gonna die or you're gonna go to hell if you do this or do that. Like, that is not the perspective or the place we should be coming from when talking about these things. Saving sex for marriage not only is biblical, but it's also practical. It shouldn't be, like the idea of saving sex for marriage shouldn't be pushed because of fear and because it's the quote unquote right thing to do. And of course, yes, it's the right thing to do. But the principles should be discussed as well as the morality behind the concept of waiting to save sex for marriage. So it's like principles should be talked about, like why, like the practical reasons for why this may be, why this is a good idea. Of course, the Bible is not specific about this, but we can look throughout human history, throughout studies, throughout sociology, throughout psychology. Why are these things actually better for us? Like the fact that if two people are virgins on their wedding night, they will have a more successful and more satisfying marriage. And if they have slept with multiple partners, that number goes down. That's something that's huge. And like every time like I'm in an environment where there are people around me who have a different morals than me, like not that they're not moral at all, but they have a different value system. They sometimes there have been times when the topic of virginities come up, and like the fact that I'm a virgin and I haven't, slept around or anything. People ask me, and I say primarily like I'm a Christian, I love God, I want to follow his word, his commandments, and I want to honor him with my life, with my body, with everything I do. But also like there's practical reasons, and I want to only share that with my husband, and I don't want to share that with multiple people. Like I only want that specific gift to be for my husband, for the father of my children, for the man I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. And so then they're like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. That's so sweet. So it's like there's reasons to save sex for marriage besides like Jesus said so, because God said so. Yes, that's a number one reason. But there are also more reasons as well. So I think it would be helpful and important to explore those reasons as well, opposed to just saying, do it because you're not supposed to, save sex for marriage because you're not supposed to have sex. And it's like, okay, can you make this practical? Can you make this make sense? Can you say it in plain English? Because it's kind of just like, okay, just check the boxes off, like the checklist, just check the boxes and there you go. And it's not just about checking boxes, it's about the principle, it's about where are we coming from, where is our heart position. And the second point that I'd like to make is a shorter one, but it is obsession with purity has resulted in hyperfixation on how not to make men stumble. It primarily focuses on female behavior, while oftentimes, unfortunately, excusing male behavior and or not addressing the issues that males may have. So basically, it's just like girls don't be a stumbling block to men, don't cause them to stumble, blah blah blah, because you should be dressing modestly, and if a guy looks at you lustfully, it's your fault. And that's absolutely ridiculous because literally Jesus says in the Bible, if a man has looked lustfully upon a woman, he's already committed adultery in his heart. Like that's on him. Yes, women have a part to play in that. Yes, we should dress ourselves modestly. Men should too. But yeah, of course, everyone should. However, if a man is acting upon his thoughts that are going on in his head, he chose to fixate on that. And of course, yeah, some men deal with lust. They do. It's unfortunate and it's something that a lot of men struggle with. That's the reality. But it's not your responsibility as a woman to prevent all men from looking lustfully on you by wearing a dress that looks like a bed sheet. Because if a man is struggling with lust, he could find something non sexual to be lustful. Like, it doesn't have to be a woman who's wearing a pretty dress. It could be a woman dressed modestly, for crying out loud. Like, I've been catcalled dressed modestly. Like, because it doesn't matter if a man is lustful, and I'm not saying that was a lustful thing, but it's like it doesn't matter. Like, if a man is lustful, it doesn't matter what he's looking at. It could be sexual to him because he's got a problem, because there's something going on with him. And so it is not fully your responsibility as a woman to not be a stumbling block for men. Usually, with this ideology, modesty is only discussed when it pertains to girls. And there's ideas, as I mentioned, like you don't want your brothers in Christ to stumble. Boys will be boys. Blah blah blah. And often, sexual desire is usually only associated with men. But humans, all humans, both genders, men and women, are sexual creatures. We are wired biologically, sociologically, psychologically to desire intimacy, and we're wired to procreate because we have to continue our race, our bloodline, Basic biology. It's normal for both genders to desire sex, but purity culture largely never teaches that. It just basically, it doesn't necessarily teach that men desire sex more, but the ideas that it preaches insinuate that men primarily have sexual desire. Men and women have sexual desire. It may not be equally, but it may be flipped. It may be that a woman has more desire than her husband. You can't just say all women are this or all men are that, because there's a spectrum of humans. Everyone's different. But usually the idea behind purity culture, pardon, is that men have the issue with lust, and it's women's responsibility to prevent that from happening by dressing modestly. We all should dress modestly. We all should, you know, all should be portraying ourselves in a classy way. We all should be honoring the Lord with our bodies and the way we dress, the way we act around people, the way we behave, all of these things. But modesty isn't just for women, modesty is for men too. And it is not women's responsibility to prevent men from lusting after them, because that's an issue in their heart. In the Bible, it says a man, if he looks upon a woman lustfully, has committed adultery in his heart. That's on him. Yes, we need God to help us. We need God to guide us and cleanse us and purify us and sanctify us, but it is not your responsibility as a woman to prevent all men from lusting after you. Because once again, as I mentioned, if a man is going to lust, he's going to lust, and it doesn't matter if he's looking at like a women's health magazine, or if he's looking at a picture of a woman in a burqa. I know that's a very extreme example, but I hope it's getting my point across. That is all that I have for today's episode. I may make another episode on it if I, do like not necessarily more research, but get some more feedback about purity culture, about what people's experiences have been. I would love to know about your experiences with purity culture if you have them. Um, in the Q&A in Spotify, feel free to write if you'd like. On other platforms, I don't know, feel free to DM me on Insta if you want, or something like that, or email me. But I'm interested in hearing stories. So if you have a story about purity culture, about how you grew up, like what ideas were taught to you about sex and relationships and dating and marriage, etc., I'd love to know about them, because it's just very interesting to look at different backgrounds and people, like what were their ideas, like how is this affecting how they react to people, or how is this affecting how they interact, and how they date and what they perceive dating to be, etc. I just think it's interesting. I think that humans are interesting. Sociology is really cool, but humans are just so interesting. There's so much nuance. I think that's why people are so interesting, is because there's just such a variety of people. Anyways, sorry for my long spiel. Thanks for listening to another episode. I really appreciate it. If you haven't already, I would appreciate a rating and or review and a share. Yeah, that would be great. I would appreciate that so much. Thank you guys again for tuning in for another episode, and I will talk to y'all next Tuesday. Ciao.